فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So for today, I want to speak more about this question about agency and power, especially regarding women figures in the Quran and Bible. And this semester, I've been working on revising and coming out with my second edition of my first book, The Bible and Qur'an, Biblical Figures in the Islamic Tradition. So one of the things John Keltner and I are doing is going back to all the entries and re-looking at them, reading them, comparing them with our previous notes, seeing what new articles and books have been published, and then potentially revising some of the things we originally said. And this is because the publisher from Bloomsbury reached out to us and said, hey, this book has been used in various courses. It would be awesome if you guys come out with a second edition. And the book has been published around 7 years ago. And there's a lot of new scholarship that have been produced. And also there were certain entries that I felt good about, but not great. And I wanted to add a little bit more research and writing. And one of them was Bilqis. So this last 2 weeks, I've been working on this entry. And this is a figure in the Quran known as the Queen of Sheeba, or Bilqis in the Islamic tradition. And this is a fascinating story in Surah An-Naml, or the chapter of the ant. And it begins by Sulyaman, or Sulyaman, and he says, why do not see the hoopy? Is it absent? So he's asking his army, where is this bird, right? The hudhud. And where is this hudhud? And the hudhud should be back. And I don't see him. And this hudhud is going to be in trouble if they don't come back or have a legitimate excuse. So he comes back and he says, I found a woman ruling over the people who has been given a share of everything. She has a magnificent throne. But I found that she and her people worship the sun instead of God. Satan has made their deeds seem alluring to them and diverted them from the right path. Should they not worship God, who brings forth what is hidden in the heavens and the earth, and knows both what you cannot conceal and what you declare? He is God, there is no God but him, and the Lord of the mighty throne. So Sulyaman hears this story from the hudhud, and he's intrigued that there is this woman out there, this Queen of Sheeba, who is worshiping other than God, but seems to have potential. She seems to be righteous. She has a magnificent throne. She's well respected by her people. Then Sulyaman sends a letter to the Queen of Sheeba, Bilqis, and says, we will see whether there's truth or a lie to this, about how she will respond to his gift. The scene transitions, and the Queen of Sheeba talks to her counselors, and she says, a gracious letter has been delivered to me, and it's from Solomon. And it says, in the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy. So this is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And as many of you know, this is the beginning of every chapter in the Quran except for one. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. And the letter continues and says, do not put yourself above me and come to me in submission to God. So the idea is that she is a polytheist. She's worshiping the sun instead of the one true God. She's not engaged in Tawheed or absolute monotheism. And he's inviting her to Islam, to submission. So she goes to her counselors. And one of the things the commentators say that she is adiba. She is someone who's cultured. She's labiba. She's someone who is wise and intelligent. She's someone that does shura, that she is engaged in consultation. So she could have acted on her own, like Pharaoh, for instance, in the Quran, that she could have said, I'm going to act this way or do that. But she has a council of people where she bounces ideas off of. And she says to these counselors, give me your counsel in the matter I now face. I only ever decide on matters in your presence. So they replied, we possess great force and power in war, but you are in command, so consider what orders to give us. So they tell her in a nutshell that she can respond, that this is a declaration of war, that Sulyaman is telling her that she needs to submit to God and submit to his power, to the kingdom of Solomon. And she asked her group and asked their council and says, what should I do? And they say, well, we should fight back. And we should fight back in a warring faction. Then she makes this remarkable statement, and she says that whenever kings go into a city, they ruin it and humiliate its leaders. That is what they do. But I'm going to send them a gift. Then see what answer my envoys bring back. So here she makes this statement regarding diplomacy, and she makes a general statement in terms of power. That yes, if we do go and fight, we may lose. And if they come into this city, then they'll ruin and humiliate its leaders. That they'll turn everything upside down. They'll become the leaders. And then they'll position the former leaders as the subjects and humiliate them. So she does something very wise. She says, I'm going to send a gift. And I'm going to send this gift to Sulyaman, and see how he responds. Is he attracted to wealth, to power, to riches, or is he really sincere in what he's saying? So her envoy comes to Sulyaman, and then Sulyaman becomes offended, and he says, what, are you offering me wealth? What God has given me is better than what he has given you, though you rejoice in this gift of yours. So he is upset, he is angry, and then he says to his group of jinn, of genies and spirits, as well as animals, and says, who can bring the throne? And several people say, hey, I can do it. I can bring her throne here to the land. And eventually one is given the responsibility and can bring it in a twinkle of an eye. All of a sudden, her throne is there, and Sulyaman sees it before him and says, this is a favor from my Lord, to test whether I'm grateful or not. If anyone is grateful, it is for his own good. If anyone is ungrateful, then my Lord is self-sufficient and most generous. So then he says, disguise her throne. We should see whether or not she recognizes it. She comes in and was asked, is this your throne? And she replied, it looks like it. So Sulyaman then says, we are given knowledge before her, and we devoted ourselves to God. And then she comes into the hall of Sulyaman, and it's told to her, enter the hall. But when she saw it, she thought it was a deep pool of water, and she lifts her skirt. And then Solomon explains that this is just a hall paved with glass. There's no water. And then she concludes and says, my Lord, I have wronged myself. I devote myself with Sulyaman to the God, the Lord of all the worlds. So what's fascinating here in this story is that there are a couple of points that speak to the idea of Bilqis as a wise and just ruler. First, she is someone who does not want to go to war, right? She knows that Sulyaman has the power and potentially the capacity to defeat her army. So she rather engaged in diplomacy, and she sends gifts back and forth, and she actually goes and visits the king to see what he is really about and whether he's sincere in his call. Also, what's fascinating is that she is someone who consults. So this is a Quranic theme that in the battle of Uhud, or one of the battles in the history of Islam in the Medinan era, that the Prophet Muhammad is told, Shawirhum fil amr. So consult these people in their affairs, consult your companions. So here we see that the queen is actually going to her council and she's asking for consultation. She's not acting unilaterally. She doesn't seem like she's a tyrant, and she's someone who is wise and thoughtful. And then this point about her coming and visiting. So this is, of course, an important act of diplomacy, that you visit other rulers and you have personal, intimate relationships with them. And she goes in and she lifts up her skirt, exposing her calf. So at this point, she is in amaze of Sulyaman, his power, his kingdom, and realizes that this is a favor from God, that this is not something just he earned on his own, but this is a sign of his divine favor. And then she says this remark, Inni zalamtu nafsi wa aslamtu ma'a Sulyaman lillahi rabbil alameen. That verily I have wronged myself, and I submit myself to Sulyaman and to God, the Lord of all the worlds. So a couple of points here in this narrative, and questions about women and power and agency. So the first one is that some commentators and even modern scholars, they say, oh, why is the Queen of Bilqis submitting herself to Sulyaman? Isn't she in a way submitting herself to patriarchal authority? And many of the classical commentators, and especially the folks in Qasas al-Anbiya, the stories of the prophets, they say that Bilqis will eventually marry Sulyaman, and that she loved him a great deal, and that they united their kingdoms, and they made this story into one of romance. It's a love story. But in reality, this story is not that of love per se. That may have occurred, but it's about submission and Islam, and the idea of submitting consciously to God and to the transcendent power of God, that God is one, that he is unique, that there's nothing like him. And what this one word, there's one word here that's essential in the narrative. She says, وَأَسْلَمْتُ مَعَ Sulyaman. So she says, I am submitting with Sulyaman to God, the Lord of all the worlds. So this word is essential because she's saying that I'm not submitting necessarily to Sulyaman, right? That could be understood or implicit, but what's zahir, or what's apparent here, is that she's submitting with Sulyaman. So she is in a way also being a Muslim, or one who submits like the Prophet Sulyaman. She is in some ways on equitable footing. Another point that emerges is that she exposes her calf. And once again, the classical commentators, many of the authors, the Qasas al-Anbiya, they really focus on this one scene. And they say that when she lifts her skirt, all of a sudden people saw that she had hairy legs, right? And this is part of some Jewish and Islamic traditions that are misogynistic and anti-women, and they emphasize potentially her manly nature, that she was a ruler, and then she had these hairy legs, and she had to remove this hair before she married Sulyaman. Now, of course, this is nowhere in the Quranic narrative, and some of the classical commentators, such as Ibn Kathir, were very critical of these traditions, and say, these traditions are nowhere found in the Quran. They don't even reinforce the Islamic or Quranic narrative. This is a narrative about worshiping God. Where does this idea of her having hairy legs emerge? And I think also modern literary scholars have said this is something that references the idea of truth. So Mustansir Mir has an article regarding this, and he mentions that the idea of exposing, the idea of showing skin, is reminiscent of the story of Adam and Eve. So in the Quran, they are in the garden, and once they ate from the forbidden tree, the eternal tree, then they become aware of their nakedness. And this is a reference to the idea of truth, that someone may be covering themselves, but truth emerges through the exposure of the body. So at this point, she goes in to this throne, and she in some ways covering herself, right? She's covering herself in shirk and polytheism and disbelief, but then her calf is exposed, and this in many ways symbolizes the idea of the exposure of truth. Truth is now known, and then she submits herself to that of God. And I think that also speaks to this other idea of the prayer that she makes at the end. She says, "O Rabbi inni zalamtu nafsi." She said, "Verily, God, I have made a mistake." And this is actually very similar to the prayer of Adam and Eve, that when they actually see their nakedness and when they see their skin, they say, "Rabbana zalamna anfusana." So almost identical. They say more in the plural form, but they say, "Oh God, we have made a mistake, and we now are submitting to you." So the Queen of Sheeba, Bilqis, is making a statement which is very similar to that of Adam and Eve. So in conclusion, we see here that in the story of Bilqis, we have a wise, cultured, and intelligent queen. She is someone who consults with her people. She wants to know what they think. She has a council that she goes to. And instead of immediately going to war, she actually engages in diplomacy. And this is maybe something you could argue many Islamic feminists would say this story, in fact, supports the idea of women rulership, because women maybe are more consultative. They're not necessarily war hungry and warmongers, but they want to actually get to know someone on a personal and relational level. So she consults, she gives a gift, then she actually travels, meets Sulyaman, and then submits to God. And I think this is really the conclusion of the story, the idea of Islam, of consciously submitting, that she's not coerced, but she comes to the realization of God on her own. And this idea of a prayer that she makes is very similar to other Quranic figures that also talk about the idea of dhulm, that they have wronged themselves. And for instance, you have in the Quran as well, Jonah of Yunus, he says, La ilaha illa ant subhanak inni kuntu min al-zalimin. He says, verily, I'm the one who made a mistake. So he uses the word of dhulm, of making injustice, which is similar to the idea here that Bilqis, or the Queen of Sheeba, makes. And at the end, we see that this is a story of her realizing that she doesn't submit herself to that of power and wealth and riches, but she actually submits herself to God. And this is the most fulfilling form of submission. Thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. I encourage you to order my book on the Islamic Mary, Maryam throughout the centuries. And this is a book that speaks about the idea of Maryam, but also other figures such as Abraham and Moses and other female ones. I would encourage you to subscribe to this podcast, encourage your friends, students, and colleagues to listen to the podcast and share it with them. Several classes have been using it, and as I've been speaking in different audiences, they've been listening to it beforehand, which really enriches the discussion. You can review this podcast. I'm really happy to see a couple of you have reviewed this podcast. That's always a form of encouragement to me. And you can visit my website and my newsletter, where you can subscribe and learn more about the publication of the Islamic Mary and the various programs and events related to it. Thanks once again, and take care.